Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us. It's Wednesday, October 8th, and this is our 14th EPIP webinar of 2014, Matching Money and Mission, Investments for Social Change. I'm your host for this afternoon's festivities, Michael Barham, Membership and Operations Manager with EPIP, and we're joined by two fabulous, esteemed panelists, Beth Hertz, Associate Program Officer at Cerdna Foundation, and Kesha Cash, Director of Investments, Impact America Fund. We're definitely going to learn a lot today. I'm excited to hear from both of our speakers, and we're going to get to them shortly. But before we do, allow me to familiarize those of you who don't know much about EPIP with who we are and what we do. We're a national network of foundation professionals and social entrepreneurs who strive for excellence in the practice of philanthropy. We are also an inclusive group of highly skilled and effective change makers committed to working together to build a just, equitable, and sustainable society. You'll say, okay, that's all well and good. What does that mean? What do you do? Well, we provide a platform for our community to connect with others, learn and practice leadership skills, and voice emerging transformative thoughts in the social sector. We do that through local events, national events, and webinars like the one you're all joining today. And hopefully we'll do a bit more of that today. So if you aren't yet an EPIP member, it's a great time to join. We have a number of fabulous activities on tap for the rest of 2014 and in 2015. And I'd love to talk to you about that, so feel free to reach out to me if you'd like to learn more. A couple of those upcoming events. Some of you may have heard our EPIP People of Color Network Gathering is taking place at Race Forwards Facing Race Conference. November 13th to 15th is the conference. The People of Color Network Gathering is on the 13th, and it's a great opportunity for you to make connections to social justice work, understand structural racism, and bring that work back home. And again, that's taking place in Dallas, Texas. Check out the website for more information. We also have a fantastic webinar on tap. In 2 weeks, it's taking place on a Monday, so not the standard Wednesday for EPIP webinars. The Power of Convergence, Advancing Equity Through Policy and Philanthropy. The Convergence Partnership is a collaborative of funders, including Kresge, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, Kellogg Foundation, whose goal of policy and environmental change will help reinvent communities of healthy people living in healthy places. We're going to learn more about that from Amanda Navarro of Policy Link and the director of the Convergence Partnership, and Jasmine Ratliff Hall of Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. So again, as always, take a look at epip.org/events to learn a bit more about what we have coming up. All right, we're going to get started shortly. A couple of items of housekeeping. Again, you'll all be kept on mute during the presentation. If you're calling in on the phone, make sure to mute your computer to avoid echo. Please, if you have any issues, use the question box. We'll be monitoring those throughout. And we'll save time, about 10 to 15 minutes, for Q&A at the end with our speakers. Feel free to send a few questions along the way and use the question box for that. We'll be monitoring those as well, and make sure to save those for the final Q&A discussion. And as always, we're recording the webinar. We're going to make sure to make the recording and the slides and any other materials, pre-readings and a few post-readings, available for everyone on our website. Check that out next week, and we'll be sure to send a link as well. And please help us out. Complete the post-webinar survey. We certainly want to make sure we can learn and improve our program. So always helpful to hear from you all. Okay, we're about to get started. We are joined, as I said, by Beth Hertz. She's the Associate Program Officer at Cerdna Foundation. Cerdna Foundation is a New York-based family foundation supporting sustainable and just communities in the U.S. In this role, Beth works with Cerdna's staff and board to bolster collaboration and impact in the foundation's grant-making, communications, and investments. And we're also, as I said, joined by Kesha Cash, Director of Investments at Impact America Fund. As Director of Investments, Kesha is responsible for Impact America Fund is responsible for improving the well-being of underserved communities and creating quality jobs in America through their investments. And we're going to learn a lot more about that today. So without further ado, I'm going to toss it over to Kesha and Beth. And hang on with us, folks. Bear with us. And I'm going to make Beth the presenter. We should be able to see her screen momentarily. Hi, Beth. Hi, Kesha.
Hi, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you.
We are just getting ready to share our screen. There we go. Okay. Thanks, Michael, and thank you to everybody for joining today. We are very excited to talk a bit about mission investing, investments for social change, and what we'll do today is give a little bit of background on the field, then talk more in detail about the Impact America Fund as a case study, and also the CERDNA Program-Related Investing Fund as a case study of how a foundation has started to get involved in mission investing, specifically program-related investing. And we'll save time for questions at the end, so make sure to get those questions ready. We want to talk about the things that you're interested in today. So to get started, just a little bit of background on foundation spending and why Kesha and I are so excited about getting greater investments into mission-related investing and program-related investing. So across the U.S., private foundations give a total of about $52 billion a year. And just as a comparison, that is completely dwarfed by the trillions of dollars in the federal government's budget. But we see an opportunity. Those same foundations hold over $700 billion in assets. And the reason they give away, as many of you know, $52 billion a year total is the minimum IRS requirement for the foundation status, the tax deductible status, tax exempt status, is to give away or spend on operations 5% of your endowment a year. And some foundations do go over that. So there's a great opportunity to tap into this resource, the rest of the assets of foundations. This looks at that information in a slightly different way. The Foundation Center has polled foundations and found that 14% are engaged in some way in mission investing, and that includes either MRI or PRI, program-related investing. And of course, some of those foundations have put only a portion of their endowment into mission investing, so even a smaller percent if you look at total endowment. But we see that this sector is growing, and a recent survey that the GIN, the Global Impact Investing Network, and JP Morgan do every year show that even just comparing 2013 to 2014, there's a 19% increase among 125 investors surveyed. So those are institutional investors, including foundations and others. And they're looking at investing 19% more this year than last year. And so just thinking about that as a change in 1 year, overall, this field is growing very rapidly. And there are many reasons that maybe some of you are talking about in your foundations, that foundations and other institutional investors are getting involved in mission investing. Really, it's a way to think about financial and social returns simultaneously. It's also a mechanism for leveraging other private investment. We know that when foundations and others who are driven by mission go into an investment first, often others follow, other private investors follow. As this slide shows, there's also a learning return for foundations. There's something to learn about how we can use market-based tools to support our missions and our values. This picture is from a TED Talk by Sterling Spurn, the former president of the W.K. Kellogg Foundation in Michigan. And I recommend that TED Talk for more information on what happened at Kellogg and how they got involved in what they call mission-driven investing that you see there. Another reason for foundations to get involved is that they want to ensure their investments are in line with their values. So beyond furthering their mission specifically, there's a layer of not doing harm and not doing anything in contradiction to the values that the institution holds. So many foundations pursue some kind of mission investing that's a layer removed from their program goals or from their mission, but is in line with their values more generally and at least doesn't cause harm. And finally, many argue that there's a fiduciary responsibility, there's a reason for supporting organizations that have social returns because those social returns often lead to financial returns as well. So it can actually be a fiscally conservative choice to support organizations that, for instance, follow environmental and social governance guidelines, ESG guidelines. There are many studies that show, for instance, that large fossil fuel companies are overvalued, and although there are immediate returns, it might not be the most fiscally prudent choice to invest in those in the long term. So incorporating social guidelines can actually be a fiscally conservative choice to make, and that's an additional reason that many foundations and institutional investors think about this. We want to acknowledge that there are a number of terms we're throwing around already, I'm throwing around already, and we don't expect you all to be able to sort out all of these terms and acronyms: mission-related investing, program-related investing, and so feel free to flag those and we can talk more about them in the questions. What we're talking about mostly here is mission investing, which is broadly any kind of tools, policies, or practices that a foundation can use to align their endowment investments with their mission or values. Program-related investing is more specific for foundations because there is an IRS distinction, and it always accepts below market rate returns. It is always for charitable causes, and it can be used to be included in that 5% annual payout that foundations make. So some foundations, including CERNA, go over that payout with PRI, but it can actually be included alongside grant making in that calculation. And as other of these terms come up, Kesha and I will try to do our best to define them. Kesha is now going to talk about some examples of specific types of investments, and then we'll go into, in detail, our 2 case studies.
Thank you, Beth. Interesting enough, when we were thinking about how to sort of articulate the space and marry asset classes with social issues, we brainstormed internally around these really 2 schools of thoughts as to how the space is currently looked at. Many view, and you'll read in a number of articles that impact investing or mission-driven investments should be looked at as a separate asset class. And then others believe that we should really integrate and layer on our impact investments within these traditional asset classes that are on the top row. There's no sort of the verdict is out, and at this point, I think there's a lot of work that still needs to be done to sort of determine where mission-driven investments or quote-unquote impact investments sort of fit into the spectrum of the larger financial system. But what we've done here is we've created on that top row highlighted the various asset classes, and we also created another square, that white square, to highlight what we're calling catalytic capital. This includes grants, intentional first loss positions, and guarantees. And that really, what we're in those examples that are underneath that column, some very powerful examples of how grants and that catalytic capital was really first capital in the door, and/or primary capital for those organizations, and then that capital helped to attract more traditional forms of financing. So just a couple examples quickly that I think are interesting. Frog Tech is a company that I know quite well. Entrepreneur, graduated from Columbia Business School. He actually participated in a traditional venture investing program at Columbia to get feedback on his company and present it to traditional investors. Did not raise capital from those traditional investors, but did go on to apply to Echo and Green and received a fellowship from Echo and Green. And if you all are familiar with Echo and Green, you know Echo and Green provides grant capital, and they've currently recently structured recoverable grants where they do hopefully get some upside if companies, for-profit companies, do well. And then they've launched recently the Social Entrepreneurship Fund, which Frog Tech was able to attract some investment dollars from there. In addition, sort of before Echo and, or right after Echo and Green, once the company got to a bit more scale, Josh Melman actually was his first angel investor. So, you know, just an example of how different layers of capital were sort of infused into the company at different parts of the, at different phases of the business life cycle. The company's raised probably close to about $5 million to date, and is now in talks with larger sort of data organizations. And the company actually empowers emerging entrepreneurs, micro-entrepreneurs in emerging markets. So it's essentially a QuickBooks type of model for really small entrepreneurs to better manage their inventory and their businesses. I have another quick example. The Global Health Investment Fund. I don't know much about this fund, but I've been following the press releases from JP Morgan Foundation and their partnership with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation on this fund. And I encourage you to really to look it up, as it has a very interesting structure in that the Gates Foundation, along with another investor, they're providing, I believe, up to 60% of sort of the first loss or guarantees for the fund. And then if the fund does well, it's a mezzanine debt fund, meaning they're really the most senior debt in the fund, and they have some sort of what they call equity kickers or warrants in the upside of deals. So the Global Health Investment Fund is really a fund to invest in later stage health technologies to enhance the well-being of folks in emerging markets. And so it's just a really interesting structure where you have someone coming in with this initial capital to say, hey, look, we're willing to lose some of this capital in order to mobilize and attract additional forms of capital to this fund. And I believe it's a $100 million fund, and they've made a few investments. And there are traditional investors involved that will reap the benefits of this fund if the fund is managed well and they see some exit. So it's a really interesting structure. And then one other, on the cash side, and Beth and I were talking about the sort of divest and invest movement that we have currently in the renewable energy square and public equities, but it really could apply across asset classes. And on the cash side, we're seeing a number of investors, high net worth individuals, family offices, who are moving their cash from traditional banks into community development financial institutions, CDFIs, and community-based banks. So Impact America Fund, we recently chose our banking partner, and we are very intentional about not working with, nothing against any of the traditional Silicon Valley banks. They're fantastic, and we'll likely work with them in the future as our companies grow. But as a progressive fund, we've chosen to work with Amalgamated Bank, which is a 90-year-old union-owned, worker-owned bank that does amazing things for the community. And so Amalgamated is one example of how one can choose to deposit their cash and work with a bank that has more progressive values.
And this shows a number of the ways that foundations can get involved, as Kesha said, across these different asset classes. And many of these examples span asset classes. A couple of other things that foundations can do that show up here are creating a positive screen. So that's what you see here, is choosing to seek out social impact for their investments or a portion of their investments. Foundations can also create a negative screen, and that doesn't show up on this chart. That means excluding certain types of investments because of the impact that they have. So the divestment movement is an example of that, excluding fossil fuel companies. And that's what Divest Invest Philanthropy is doing. Foundations can also think about active ownership. So they can think about the ways that they're engaged in any funds that they are involved in. So whether it's a conventional investment or a responsible investment, there are ways to be involved as a shareholder, particularly in public equity. Mm-hmm. So there are some other approaches that foundations can use to actively sort of enliven their portfolio to think beyond just the investments that they're making, but how are they engaging in those investments. The last one that I'd mention is manager recruitment and engagement. So many foundations are having conversations now about the racial and gender diversity of their fund managers, since this is something for many of us that is in line with our mission and values, and it might be something that we integrate in how we recruit staff and consultants. It's also something that we can apply to how we work with fund managers in our investments. So a number of approaches are shown here.
And I'll add, there's one company, Happy Family, that some of you may be familiar with, but it's an interesting story. The company sold earlier this year, or late last year, I believe it was earlier this year, to Danone for over $200 million. And that was a Happy Family is a provider of organic baby food. And that company received PRI money from a very large foundation, had traditional investors involved. I actually know one of the investors now in my fund was an angel investor in Happy Family. So it's, there are ways to, make money and do good. And we were intentional also about leaving off sort of the risk-return profile, as what we're starting to see is none of these companies, organizations, or initiatives really fit into a nice bucket per se, but we're seeing sort of hybrid approaches, hybrid uses of different types of financial tools, and then there's a lot of overlap. A number of these companies would fit in, a few other areas in terms of social issues as well. So Beth pulled this picture of me off of the Impact America website. We don't have much content yet on the website, as we made a sort of public announcement about the fund on July 4th in New Orleans as part of a Power Moves NOLA, actually a minority-focused initiative in New Orleans to identify and help seed fund more minority-owned companies. We've been working closely with that organization and had the opportunity to leverage that platform to announce the coming of Impact America Fund. And we officially turned our lights on recently, so we're thrilled about that, and we will be making our first investment very soon. But quickly, Impact America Fund really is the evolution of a 3-year initiative that I launched in 2010 with Josh Melman, who is a prolific angel investor, I will say, in the impact space. So Josh has been investing for, his own money for over 20 some odd years, and for the last 7 years has been managing a private investment fund that invests across the globe into early stage impact investments. And that fund, Serious Change, has invested over $60 million out of the Fund 1 over the last 6 years. And they're now launching a Fund 2. So I had the privilege of working with Josh Melman and Serious Change to build out the Jalia Ventures portfolio. And the goal of that portfolio was to identify and invest in minority-owned companies that fit the criteria of the larger global fund. So interesting enough, we oftentimes, I'll say this, I'm a minority, and I end up in most rooms that are impact investment or social enterprise related, but there are very few people of color that are in those rooms, and very few entrepreneurs of color that are accessing capital. And what we found from our work over the last 3 years, now 4 years, is that, minority entrepreneurs that we identified actually did not self-identify. Most of them did not self-identify as mission-driven companies. So there's a disconnect between what's happening in the impact investment space and what's actually happening on the ground. So our role with Jalia Venture was to really close that gap. We made 10 investments over the 3-year period. And then I rolled out of that Serious Change umbrella last year around this time with the support of Josh Melman and Serious Change to launch Impact America Fund. And Impact America Fund's mission, while we're not exclusively focused on minority entrepreneurs, our investment thesis is that we believe that there are huge market opportunities in underserved communities, and we believe that there are people out there creating innovative solutions to address issues in underserved communities that are, that can be, those solutions can be large, scalable companies. So one example that I'll give is a company that Josh and I actually invested in under Jalia Ventures, and we will be investing in an Impact America fund as well. It's a company named Pigeonly, and Pigeonly provides lower-cost communication services to inmates. And the story around the company, everything about the company is really interesting in that the entrepreneur spent 4 years in federal prison for trafficking marijuana. Very smart guy, has never smoked or drank a day in his life, so it's ironic what he went to prison for. But he had an honorable discharge from the Air Force, saw inefficiencies in his friend's business in terms of how they were moving around marijuana, and thought he'd help by creating a much more efficient sort of logistics business to support their efforts. Unfortunately, he got busted. Fortunately, actually, because something was much better for him on the other side. So he went to federal prison for 4 years. With $30 in his pocket, he participated in the new Me Accelerator that's based out in San Francisco. Graduated from that accelerator in May or June of last year, and by July 4th, I actually remember it was over July 4th weekend that Josh and I were working on this deal. He raised $1 million. We participated in that deal. Kapor Capital, Mitch and Freda Kapor, if you're not familiar with them, definitely look up what they're doing. They're doing a wonderful work out in the Bay Area. Invested Base Ventures, which is a traditional venture capital firm, tech venture capital firm, invested, and the founder of that firm happens to be African American and was one of the first angel investors in Zappos, which sold $4 billion to Amazon a few years ago. And the company has since raised more dollars and is closing another round of capital. So we're excited about this company for a number of reasons, given who the entrepreneur is. He's one of the most business-savvy people that I've ever met. He's built a team of 13 people. He's based out in Vegas. And I love to highlight the fact that he's not a techie himself, but he understands technology, and he's been able to attract hardcore technologists that do not look like him and his founders, who a number of them have spent some time, in the system, so to speak. And so if you were to visit the company, you see this integration, true integration taking place, or true integration taking place in that you have hardcore techies that are, white guys working alongside of founders who are African American and who have, spent some time in a very different environment. And so the collaboration between the two really excites us. And it's a large industry. And I have to share the stat that the inmate phone service industry is a $1.2 billion a year revenue just from phone services alone. And then there are other products and services that we think can be launched to help long-term reduce the recidivism rate in this country, which we know is really off the charts, and it makes no sense. So thrilled about that company. Our goal is to identify other companies like Pigeonly that are serving low and moderate income communities. We're investing $250 to $2 million per company, and the great thing is that our LPs are also direct investors, and so if we can find good deals and help these companies scale, then there's sort of adequate, there's enough capital to get them there, and we only invest in companies that we think will also attract traditional dollars. So our goal is to really get more impact-oriented companies into the mainstream tech pipeline or other industry pipelines. And so, one thing I have to note around that mission piece is that we're extremely focused on that mission, that mission aspect of the business that we're doing. I tell everyone if it was not for the mission, I'm not sure I'd make all the sacrifices that I've had to make to launch this fund and to do this early stage work. There's nothing easy about it, but it's work that's necessary. And so we are being very strategic about how we think about mission. And thankfully, earlier this year, we actually received a grant from the Cerna Foundation to support us in how we develop our mission management system, so that mission management is reported on as the business model and strategy is reported on during our board meetings with companies, and we want to ensure that as these companies scale and grow, the mission is also scaling alongside the company. And I think we'll start to hear more and more talk about how that's actually done. We spent a lot of time, which is needed, developing measuring systems sort of after the fact. But I think what we're going to realize is that it's not as easy as one would think to scale and grow mission, real mission that actually, if the company were to be acquired or a large traditional investor invested in the company, the mission should be so strong in the company to the point where if the mission, if there was any effort to cause mission drift, the company's business model would break. So we want the mission of that company to be tied hand in hand. And Beth made a good point in that we're investing with the belief that the social issues that we're targeting and the way that these companies will be built in the long term will add competitive advantages to our companies, and that if we treat all stakeholders fairly, if employees are treated fairly, if the end consumer is treated fairly with a quality product at a fair price, and that product or services is helping to enhance their well-being, to me it just makes sense that our companies will be the go-to companies, and will begin to chip away and disrupt some of these long-standing traditional players who have honestly taken advantage of vulnerable communities. So we are a quite progressive, I should probably stop there, impact fund. We do believe we'll make a lot of money because there's a lot of money being made off of underserved communities, but do it in a way that actually creates paths of upward mobility for these communities.
Great. So you all are probably starting to see that there are these layers here, almost like a Russian doll, when we talk about impact investing. So at the core, Kesha just gave a great example of Pigeonly, which is an actual social business, social enterprise. And then there's a layer of funds and intermediaries that seek out and invest in enterprises like Pigeonly, and Impact America is one of those funds. They also seek funding, seek investments from institutional investors. So a PRI program is the next layer of how funds flow to social enterprises like Pigeonly. So I'll talk a little bit about that next layer, our PRI fund, and we could even go a little bit broader. I'll mention at the end, more broadly, the mission investing approach that CERDNA is starting to think about now. So since now I'm talking about CERDNA, you'll see a CERDNA graphic. So I'll talk a little bit about the ways that CERDNA got involved in program-related investing, then how we specifically developed the fund, and a little bit about two examples that our first two investments, what they were. So the way that we got involved in mission investing is not, our board woke up one day and created a fund. Like many things, there was a lot of work to set the table over time that made it possible. There was interest in our board and across our staff, but not a lot of knowledge, I think, like at many foundations. And that interest built over time, and it was also very intentionally cultivated. So our board decided 9 years ago, a family board, to include 3 non-family board members for the first time. And they recruited in those positions individuals who know philanthropy and specifically had financial expertise and knowledge of the impact investing field where possible. So they helped to round out the expertise on the board and the interest in doing this. There was also a board education process that was gradual over time as they realized that there might be opportunity to think about our mission and endowment alignment. There was some work to educate themselves on what was possible there. Then more recently, our board developed a new mission. And in that process, we stated very clearly who we are and how we want to show up in the world, what we call our identity and method. The staff and board developed that together, and it showed that we wanted to have clear strategies about what we aim to accomplish in each of our programs, and also that we want to use all the tools available to us to achieve those strategies. So program-related investing was one thing of several things that clearly followed from that logic. As once we laid out that this is who we want to be to achieve our mission, it became clear that there was a tool that we hadn't tapped into yet, and that we wanted to explore. And it also became clear that we could think about, as we're thinking about measuring our impact, it would be possible to think about the social and financial returns of investments. So we developed strategies in our programs coming out of this new mission process. Each of our programs developed specific strategies, and in that process actually laid out opportunities for program-related investing. So I think this was a key step for us, that before we even had a PRI fund, our program staff were getting used to the idea of thinking in those terms. This is a stretch for many of us, including myself on the program side of a foundation, and we had to get used to new language and looking for opportunities in a different way. So at the point when we were developing those strategies, naming the goals and outcomes for each of our programs and how we were going to go about achieving them, we were already thinking, okay, how could a program-related investment complement this strategy? Kind of a blue sky thought exercise, because we didn't have such a thing yet. But that helped us build capacity in program as well. The other thing we did is we added staff at this time. We decided that to achieve the goals of our strategic plan and to carry out the work the way that we wanted to, really supporting fields, investing in new fields, being very engaged and communicating our learning with our partners, we wanted to staff for that. So we grew our program team at that time too, and I think that was also something that set the stage and made it possible for us to eventually create a PRI program. Then more recently, in the last couple years, we started having conversations with our board specifically about what PRIs look like. And with the expertise on our board and new ideas on our staff, it was a natural conversation to have. We also had a couple of very strong board champions at that time who helped to guide the conversation. So we brought in external experts to present on program-related investing, including a grantee partner. We had Don Hinkle-Brown, the executive director of the Reinvestment Fund in Philadelphia, with whom we had worked for a long time, and who could talk about the ways that they use investments from other investors alongside grants as tools to achieve their goals, and how that aligns with goals that we've set in our programs. Coming out of that conversation, our board decided to go ahead and create a fund, and we brought on external consultants, BWV Solutions, to help us do that. We developed the details of what the fund would look like, how we would make decisions, what we were aiming to accomplish with it, and how we would track the performance of the fund. We decided, and our board decided, to set aside 2% of our endowment, up to 2%, to make these investments, and that would be on a revolving basis as a pool. As those investments come back, we're able to make them again. So this is one of the ways, make new investments. So this is one of the ways that a PRI fund can have more impact, because you're able to constantly seek out new investments and spark new ways of working in your fields. So we said 2%, up to 2% of our endowment. We also said that would be over and above our 5% payout a year. So any amount that we invest in a given year is on top of the 5% that we're paying in grant making and operations. And this was a bold move on the part of our board. This is not something that many foundations have done yet. Many foundations use PRI as a tool that can, as I mentioned before, that can count towards the minimum IRS required payout. So going above was a way of stating also that we are interested in looking at our entire endowment, at the rest of our endowment, and using this as a way to learn more about what that could look like. So our first two investments that I'll talk about were to Bach Capital and RSF Social Finance. Bach Capital is a fund that supports small businesses. In this case, it is accessing dollars that came from the federal government to respond to infrastructure needs after Superstorm Sandy in the New York area. So these funds are administered by New York City, the Small Business Administration, and we went in jointly with a division of Goldman Sachs to develop this fund. The reason is many of my colleagues had actually worked in New Orleans, either as grant makers or being in New Orleans after Katrina, and had seen that small businesses, especially small businesses run by entrepreneurs of color and women and immigrants, were not accessing all of the contract money that was coming out through the federal government and the city. And part of this had to do with networks. Kesha mentioned this before. It also had to do with capacity of small businesses and cash flow issues, ability to wait for those payments, which could sometimes take a long time to process. So my colleagues saw a need to address that through a revolving loan fund, basically a bridge loan, to help small businesses access those contracts coming out. So the goal of this for us was to support small businesses. It's something that we're doing through our grant making, and now we're able to apply a new tool to that as well, specifically small businesses run by entrepreneurs of color and women, and to create jobs, especially in communities that are historically left out and don't have access to new job creation. And at the same time, this is contributing to sustainable infrastructure in the region. So that's the first fund that we invested in at CERDNA. The other investment is through RSF Social Finance, and RSF is aiming to link regional food supply with urban demand with this fund. And this is something that our Sustainable Environments program has been thinking a lot about through grant making as well. So as they see a loss of farmland around cities and urban areas, and they're also seeing a lack of access to healthy food and fresh food in those cities, as well as very few mechanisms for sourcing regionally in larger institutions like hospitals and schools, where they could source all of their procurement, all of their cafeteria food from regional sources, but those connections don't exist. So food hubs are helping to make those connections and solve all three of those problems, address all three of those problems simultaneously. And food hubs do that through sometimes a physical location and sometimes just creating the links, communication systems, and other tools for linking up the farmers in the surrounding area and the need in cities and with large institutions. But there's often an issue in accessing early on, a cash flow issue, similar to the small businesses we were seeing in the New York area. For farms to access cash, to access the contracts, the procurement contracts, they also need to be able to wait and have a significant cash flow to be able to wait for those payments from hospitals and schools. So this is another problem that food hubs can help address with investment from institutional investors. So the RSF fund is seeking out food hubs across the country. There's an early example from their past work in Philadelphia that is doing exactly this, that is creating the infrastructure to connect regional food supply and at the same time increase access to healthy and fresh food in cities. So those are the first two program-related investments that CERN has been involved with. And as we see the success of those, we're also just beginning to explore what are the other ways that our mission might be aligned with our endowment. So we can look across our endowment, our asset classes, and look for opportunities for mission and value alignment, as we talked about. And this is something that our board has set as a priority for the coming year. So program-related investing for CERDNA is an early way to learn and understand better the impact investing field and how we might engage in it. So with that, I'm going to pause, and I think Michael's going to manage questions and answers here.
Yes, thanks so much, Beth. Thank you, Kesha. That was really fascinating and informative, and it's great to hear kind of the two different perspectives that you both were able to bring to the discussion. So as Beth said, we'd like to open it up for questions. I certainly have a few of my own, but we've heard plenty from me, so folks, please don't be shy. Take a moment, type your questions into the question box, and we'll be keeping an eye out. We have a few minutes to discuss. Doesn't look like any are coming in yet, so yeah, I do have a couple of questions. And Beth and Kesha, I'd love, first, Beth, you talked a bit about this, and kind of how you got the process started at CERDNA, but I'm sure folks are wondering, how, if there aren't necessarily champions on the board, how can you change the mind of advisors or decision makers and prompt the exploration of a mission investing program?
Well, I'll wave my magic wand, but if that doesn't work, I'd really recommend that, this is the question that all of us are thinking about and struggle with, and I'd recommend to anybody considering some kind of mission investing to think about this more as a change management exercise than a question of expertise. And of course, it's always helpful to have expertise in the room and at key moments to figure out who those advisors, those trusted advisors in particular, can be and expose them to your board or decision makers. But I think really what's key, like any change management exercise, is understanding your own organization and its politics. Finding who might be a champion, maybe it's you, or who might be in a position to be cajoled into being a champion or informed enough to become a champion, and work within those opportunities. I think one thing that we often see is that there are barriers built into how foundations are set up. Many foundations are seeking maximum return in order to achieve perpetuity, to constantly grow the endowment and have the ability to give out at least as much or more forever. And so that means that any investment decision makers are hamstrung. They're limited by that guideline, by the way that the policy is set up at the institution. And so looking at that as a place to begin a discussion, if our guidelines were different, what would you be able to do, I think can be useful because many individuals see themselves against a barrier that's really codified. And once that's taken away, are happy to change the way they operate. So that's something I've seen. It's an exercise in creativity often, and a question of exposure to understand what is available and what would I do if my guidelines were different. If job performance in my role, whether it's as a chief investment officer or as a board member on the investment committee, if my role were defined differently, what would I do with it? And that can often help to trigger some new ideas and new ways of setting up the organization's policies.
That's a great way to frame the issue. Thanks, Beth. Actually, I have a couple of questions coming in. So one quick one for Beth from Sean Tennyson. Thanks, Sean. He's wondering, what was the timeline for developing the fund?
Great. Thanks, Sean. We began to talk about a fund specifically 2 years ago. So it took about a year and a half from having the conversation that with our board, which was essentially, if you approve this, we will go figure out how to set up a fund and what that means. It only took about 5 months from there with our advisors to actually flesh out the details of what the fund would look like. And then it wasn't until the following year that we had our first 2 investments. So it can take a while, especially if you have specific program goals that you're looking to achieve, to source those deals and develop them and find them. But we had the whole thing launched, I think, in about 18 months.
It's great. Had another question come in from Claire Austin. Claire, thanks you both for joining. And she's wondering, can you talk about the difference between investing in funds versus directly in companies? Is one riskier? Is there a type of investor, foundation, family, etc., best suited to one or the other?
Hi, so I'll take a stab at this, but it'll be great to also hear Beth's feedback. As a fund manager, our investors range from larger sort of family office structures and institutional investors that have their internal teams, but they are not focused on earlier stage investment. So essentially they're outsourcing that work to us and are paying us a fee to do that work. But they do want to, co-invest at a later stage. That's sort of one type of investor. We have another family office that's a smaller family office. They also do direct deals. They'll likely co-invest smaller amounts alongside of the fund. And then we have a couple of individual investors who are not, they're angels. They may invest sort of here or there if things come to them, but they're not actively seeking out deal flow in underserved communities in America. So they're really leaving that challenge up to us. So, from my perspective, I think it just kind of depends internally of, what does the team structure look like and the resources you have to dedicate to direct deals versus using intermediaries to manage that process for you.
I think that's exactly right. From a foundation perspective, it's a significant amount of capacity and expertise to be able to source those individual deals, to find the Pigeon Lees of the world, and so often we rely on funds. If it's a bigger foundation or you have a significant amount that you're investing, sometimes it's worthwhile to have staff in-house, but for many of us it makes sense to use intermediaries who can really spend the time working with the individual enterprises also and help them develop their plans and be more successful.
And I would add that the larger sort of the pool of capital is, the more likely you are to use intermediaries. There's an organization that had a 7-year strategy, and they're working with a lot of capital, and they were doing a number of direct deals, and they have a pretty large portfolio now of direct deals, and it became, I think, a bit unwieldy at one point. And they said, hey, we want to write larger check sizes and have greater impact. How do we do that? So they've recently shifted strategies to do that, to write larger check sizes and more like a larger sort of later stage private equity way. But it was through that process of experimenting with direct deals and through funds and realizing this may not be the right strategy for us. So all in all, I think, get going. It's sort of like the lean startup model for impact investing. Once you start doing a few deals, you kind of realize what your strengths and weaknesses are at that point.
Great. Those were fantastic answers. I have questions are pouring in now, guys. So we have another question from Elizabeth. She works with an arts organization that gives micro grants to artists in the Philadelphia area. What advice would you two have for attracting and building relationships with mission-driven investors?
So it's a great question, Elizabeth. I think for many enterprises that are just starting to think about institutional investing as a tool for them, if these artists haven't done this before, it's a shift in thinking, and it's a challenge to develop a business plan. So there's a certain amount of technical assistance and training that can be really helpful early on, and it's something that we've done with certain partners. Is we've considered using grants, for instance, to build up that capacity to ensure that there's a healthy business plan and really something that's investable for institutional investors, so that then when you're approaching with an idea, it's well developed and it's already had the support from experts in the field to make it something that would be attractive to investors.
Great. Okay, we had another question come in from Sean. Looks like this one's for Beth. Have you noticed any changes in your grant making since beginning the PRIs? Was the level of creative or out-of-the-box thinking increased when the PRI component was incorporated, or did your program officers feel more restricted in their proposals?
That's a great question, and I don't have a really I think our program work broadly, so grant making and PRIs, has gotten more creative in the sense that PRIs unlocked a new tool that allowed our programs to think differently about something like supporting alternative business models, cooperative business models, and others. So we think about how we use policy tools through our grant making and communications and organizing. And this opened up for the first time that we could also use an investment in businesses to support those same goals. So I think that led to a lot of creativity, and I think that was really complemented by the grant making. So as we see these new ideas, it's led in some cases to new approaches within our grant making. For instance, our Thriving Cultures program is pursuing now an effort to support community design and community engaged design. And eventually that might take a form like a program-related investment, but to start, they have issued, along with Kresge, an RFP for developing through a grant that kind of program that could later absorb a PRI potentially. So having a PRI tool led to this whole new idea and whole new approach, which is starting out with grant funding now for us. So I think it's a great question that we actually think differently, not only in our PRI investments, but also in our grant making.
Yeah, that was a great question. It's a really interesting way to think about it. So thank you, Sean. And thanks, Beth. It looks like we're actually running right up on 4 p.m. So we actually were able to fit in a lot of great questions, more than usual. Thank you all for those. And remember, you can see a lot of these resources available on your web view. You'll be able to access those on the EPIP website by early next week. We'll also make the recording available, and these slides and any other resources, including the pre-readings that we sent out earlier. Thank you all for joining us, and please do remember to complete your post-webinar survey. Let us know how we can improve. And lastly, just want to thank you, Beth and Kesha, for the very informative, fascinating webinar, and we appreciate you spending the time with us this afternoon.
Great. Thank you all.
Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, folks. Have a great day.